Okay, so we'll begin with basic information. So can we please have your full name, your date of birth, and your place of birth, please?
Yes. Full name, Eric Alexander Freedman. Date of birth, 9th September 1941. Place of birth, Corbridge, near Hexham, Northumberland in England.
Okay, thank you. Could you please tell us a little bit about your background, your upbringing, and your education?
Sure. So I was brought up in Newcastle on Tyne, northeast England, in a suburb called Fenham. I was the oldest son. I had a younger brother, since deceased in 86. And we were brought up by my two parents, of course, two parents since deceased, my father in textiles and my mother at home. And I went to primary school and grammar school in Newcastle, to Cowgate Primary School, Wingrove Primary School, and then in those days it was called King's College, University of Durham. This became afterwards the University of Newcastle. When I was there, it was King's College, University of Durham, where I studied. Before that, I went to the grammar school called Rutherford Grammar School, which actually the Queen Mother opened on the West Road in Newcastle in the 1950s. Rutherford before was in Bath Lane in Newcastle, then it moved to the West Road. This school is now closed. It was a grammar school where I studied for O levels and then A levels. Then I went to King's College, where I studied French. It was called French and International Relations, which basically means French literature of all periods and modern history. And then I took my degree, bachelor's in honours at Newcastle, Durham. And then there was the big choice to make. What do I do with a BA in French? We're now in 1965. And so in 1965, the choice was either do what we called in those days a dip ed and then become a grammar school teacher of French. Choice number two, try to get into the civil service, class A, which in those days was either the Home Office or the Foreign Office. I was all addressed in the Foreign Office. Option three was Reuters, was a press agency, okay? And so in fact, I decided not to do a dip ed. I didn't want to become a grammar school teacher, but I did civil service exams in London, because I did a training, not really a training course. I was assistant in 64, 65, and about 63 and 64 in the Foreign Office. And I did Foreign Office exams, but I didn't get through. And I was offered a possibility in Internal Revenue, but I decided to turn that down. Reuters, I took exams, didn't get through because I didn't like sports and I had to write about sports. However, at the same time, the English-speaking union had possibilities to apply for American universities in 1965. And I had to give the names of American universities with a project. And this covered, I think it was Columbia, Cornell. There were about 5 universities, and I had to decide on a project. And in those days, we're still in 65, the concept of what today is banal, which is called media communications or media studies or mediology, hardly existed. I mean, McLuhan was very new. And so I prepared a whole project for a discipline that in those days did not exist, which was sort of mediology. And I sent this off for analysis, and I got it on the strength of this, 65. I got into Cornell University, but Department of Romance Studies, because the motto in those days of Cornell University is, we offer a subject, we offer courses in any subject. But in fact, they chose me because of my strengths in French, because by then I was almost, bilingual in French. since I'd gone to university in France as well in 63, 64. I'd been to lycée. And so in 65, I went by boat to the States. Boat in those days, people forget today, was cheaper than air travel. Air travel was a total luxury in 65. And so with some of my poor grandmother's savings, I managed to get a passage on an Italian 10,000-ton boat, whose name I now forget, which went from Southampton to Le Havre and then across to New York. It took 10 days. And 5 days I was ill and 5 days was paradise, you know. And then I got to New York in 65. And so I went to graduate school from 65 to 70 in New York. This is upstate New York State. This is Ithaca, New York. It's a very famous university, which I'm sure you know. This is the Department of Romance Studies. My advisor, he's still alive, he must be 94 now, was Professor Grossvogel. And in fact, my whole thesis or you know, research interest changed. It was not in media. It was, in fact, now in Romance studies, being really Romance, French, Spanish, Romanian, and still international relations and philosophy. And I became a specialist in a Romanian French writer and philosopher, and I'm still a specialist on this, called Benjamin Fondane, F-O-N-D-A-N-E, Fondane. And over the last 50 years, I've published, you know, lots of articles, books, manuscripts, etc., on this French-Romanian writer. And from Cornell, in 1970, I was appointed for 2 years to, so the intervening year that we're going to talk about, 67, 68, in fact, was when Cornell sent me and a group of other Cornell graduate students to the École Normale Supérieure in Paris from 67 to 68 to study with the great French philosopher Jacques Derrida at the time, and also to study with a great French critic who is still alive called Gérard Genette, in addition to American professors. That was the time, of course, of French philosophy, French structuralism, that what was called in those days French theory, heavily influencing Cornell, Yale, Johns Hopkins. In fact, it was a group of about 5 or 6 students from Cornell and 5 or 6 students from Johns Hopkins that met and had privileged access in a seminar only for us with Jacques Derrida, who at the time hadn't published his first book, L'écriture, la différence, but was working on Plato at the time, and we had seminar. So that was the reason I was in Paris in 67, 68, you know, from the fall of 67 through the summer of 68, was on an American university program with École Normale Supérieure to study. Of course, later on, Derrida was very often invited both to Yale, Cornell. I mean, you know, he later on came regularly to US universities. And that was the reason. And afterwards, of course, I went back to Cornell. And in 70, I was appointed to Middlebury College in Vermont for 2 years. Middlebury is, as you know, is the top language where French, everything is done in French or German or whatever the language. All the courses are done there. And in Cornell, by the way, I had taught French language and French literature and French theater. And in Middlebury, in addition to teaching, I created the first course in French creative. In those days, I mean, today it's also banal to speak about creative writing courses, but we forget in the early 70s, this was very new. So I created the first French creative writing course at Middlebury, and the second course I created with Professor Alan Thayer, who's retired now, living in Bulgaria. But, and we had a battle to get it past the faculty. You're not going to believe this, it's such a banality today, was the teaching French cinema. Would you believe the teaching of modern French? We're talking about Middlebury College in 1972, okay? We forget that Vermont in those days was very right-wing. Today it's very left-wing with Bernie Sanders. But everybody forgets that Vermont was very, very traditional and right-wing. And in 1972, we had a battle with the faculty who said French cinema is not French literature, etc. I mean, it's hard to believe today, but we won the battle, and we taught the first course in French cinema. This was before internet, before video, so the students watched the actual film 3 to 6 times. We taught Godard, Truffaut, Alain René, all these, the Nouvelle Vague cinéastes, in 1970 to 72. Then in 72, people forget, once again today, there was an economic crash in the US, and the main input of university money in the US was the Defense Education Act of the 50s as a result of Sputnik. People also forget that today. Between 58 and 68, the money, the government poured money into studies of the humanities and English and mathematics. In 72, crash came. No more language courses would be funded, no more literature courses, no more humanities, no more mathematics. I think people forget the whole history of this business of university education. And what happened was, basically, in 72, I applied for several jobs in the States. Of course, there were big risks because remember the Vietnam War was going on and people were being called up. So there was a risk, even for non-US people to be involved in that. This being said, there were 2 positions, I think it was in Dartmouth and in Nova Scotia in Canada, not funded. So in 72, I came back to the UK with, of course, no jobs, no job prospects, came back home. And in 1972 in the UK, we also forget there was an economic crisis and there were no jobs in the UK. However, there were jobs in Ireland. It sounds strange. There were jobs in Ireland, but also people forget today, Ireland, we're talking about the Republic of Ireland, was very, very reactionary, very Catholic. And I was interviewed for a job to create the University of Limerick, but they told me that Sartre and Camus were banned. They were on the index. People forget today that the Irish Republic was applying the Catholic index of banned books in 1972. Which meant Sartre, Camus, Malraux, etc. All this is forgotten history, although it's very, very recent. And it shows how the world has really changed. And so I refused position in Limerick because I could not teach freely. And fortunately for me, and because we are going to talk about 68, one of the indirect consequences, in fact, of May 68, was to change a lot of education attitudes in France, including attitudes, what we would call from the conservative right, and I'm speaking about somebody called Jacques Delors, D-E-L-O-R-S, who we can say was a center-right politician, really, let's say center-left in some cases, who in 71, 72, proposed the Further Education Act, Formation Continue, where all companies had to subsidize higher education for employees. And so I came to France in 73 and once again recycled myself into teaching English and French, and teaching French still, but still teaching English in the context of higher education, meaning not university education, but what we would call further education, adult education, vocational education, both in, basically in private institutes. Mm-hmm. And so, my basic career in France from, let's say, 73 until I retired in 2003 was in the teaching of English, French, and business techniques and negotiation techniques in 2 main institutes. One, Institut Français de Gestion, the French Institute of Management, where I sort of climbed up the ladder, and became Director of Education, Director of Quality, and Director of Training, with 120 teachers teaching 15 languages, and introducing courses in negotiation techniques in English and French. And while I was doing that, I was appointed, since my Wednesday afternoons were free, I was appointed to the University of Orléans from 1986 to 2003 as a professor of negotiating. I introduced the teaching of negotiation techniques in English in the master's degree program, both in the international commerce degree in the humanities faculty and in the law faculty at Orléans University. And that continued, as I said, both positions until 2003. And then I have another career change because one of the reasons I retired in 2003 was as a result of ongoing research and legal actions taken in US federal courts against France for Holocaust spoliation and seizure of properties. Now, during all the time I was, of course, a student of French language and literature, I was also a student of French history. And because of my own background, very aware and intellectually interested in Vichy regime and, of course, the Nazi regime, since I am, of course, Jewish. And so I was, and had family involved in all that. And so really knowing about British culture and French culture and the Vichy and Nazis, because of this, I was approached in 2003 by lawyers from both sides, by lawyers from the who wanted to defend the French banks, and by lawyers who wanted to find, let's say, the dirt on what really happened under Vichy, who asked me to become part of their research team. And first of all, I refused the lawyers from, these were leading American lawyers working for the French banks. So I refused the American lawyers working for the French banks, but I accepted the American lawyers who wanted to find out what happened in Vichy France between 1940 and 44, according to the, especially on the subject of bank spoliation. What did the banks do? What did the banks do? And and I said to them, well, as a manager in a French company, I cannot just resign like that, you know, because an American can do this. I said I need 3 months. But I managed to get a year off, and then of course I took my retirement, and I worked with the Wiesenthal. You've heard of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who has a research team in the States and a research team in Paris, and I worked with them in national archives, in municipal archives, departmental archives, and not allowed into bank archives, but also other archives, finding the way around with the Chamber of Commerce archives to find out what happened. And parallel to this, as of 1997, the French government itself appointed the Marioli Commission. So parallel to US federal cases and research, parallel to US research, that I always call this a parallel historiography, there was a French government commission set up. And it's true, after 3 years, they published 13,000 pages and 13 volumes on all of this. And this came to show that, in fact, yes, there had been massive spoliation. What was the upshot of all this? Just in a nutshell, was in 2001, to avoid what we can call really a diplomatic incident between the US and France, there was an amicable, we can't call it an amicable agreement, we will say a realpolitik treaty, international treaty, called the French-American Washington Agreement, signed in Paris in January, in Paris and Washington in January 2001, which is called the French-American Washington Agreement on indemnification, and this was to be included in the already agreed upon French Commission on Spoliation Indemnification. As a result of this treaty, since then, since 2001, there's an article, can't remember, I think it's Article K, and this international treaty appoints the Wiesenthal Center to supervise the enactment of the treaty by all parties, and the Wiesenthal Center appointed me as their representative in France, in the States, to supervise with the Commission, the French Government Commission, with which I'm still in contact, the enactment, especially on the economic side, on the banking side of this treaty, which I do to this day. I represent, I have like two hats. One, I represent, of course, the international treaty in relation to the enactment of it. And number two, I represent individual claimants if they send me an affidavit. And I represent individual claimants from the whole world, usually from the US or Israel or France, in front of the Commission to pursue their interests. And that I've been doing. And with Professor Weisberg, who is also a supervisor from Cardozo University, from Cardozo Law School, we've been working to this. As a result of that, of course, with the expertise I gained in this, with the unspent spoliation indemnification money, a foundation was established to create a Holocaust and Genocide Research Center at Cardozo Law School, to which I was appointed visiting professor regularly since 2003. And since then, this center has become really a main research center, not, let's say, less on the Holocaust issue as on genocide prevention. And so now it's really one of the leading centers on what we can call still Holocaust research and genocide prevention. And that brings us to today.
Wow, what an interesting trajectory. I'm not sure my trajectory will be so interesting. It shows you how times change and trajectories change also. So if we could go back to...
Sure.
Just before you go to France in 67, 68, had you had any experience with political, social militancy before?
No, just what I knew about France, because I must admit that just before going, I recall the main issues were Vietnam, the main issues were Biafra, the main issues were still the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it was, it's interesting to think that France was not, was not a main discussing point. Even in our studies, no, I mean, it was really on the French literature scene, on the French political scene. No, there was more on the French political scene. I remember when I was at King's College from 60 to 65. With the development of L'Express and Nouvel Observateur and Algeria. We've just gone off.
No, it's still. Are you still there? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. What do I do here?
I can't see any problems with mine. Just let me see.
I can't see you anymore. What do I click on?
Okay, just 1 second. Gallery view.
Can you
see anything now?
I just see, no, it says obtain your own account free, register for free. I mean, do I zoom launch? Just a minute.
Does it say anything at the top?
Okay, we're back.
We're back, okay.
So, So, no, politically, no, as before we left, no, it was basically, no, literary, from a philosophical side, I just have an interesting comment to make. One of my Cornell teachers at the time was Paul Demont, who later on was shown to have had, you know, neo-fascist inclinations, and he managed to get to America. But I remember Paul de Man telling me, when I told him I was going to study with Derrida, he said, this would be like studying at the feet of Heidegger. And of course, we know what Heidegger's policies were now, but less known in those days. But to answer your question truthfully, no, I have no recollection of political events in France coming to any forefront or even in background, apart from our interest, as I would say, in French literature and philosophy.
And how would you describe your experiences with France that you had had previous to 68? Did you say you were there as a student?
Yeah, in 63, yeah. So previous to that, I'd spent a year in France in 63, 64, teaching. That was also experimental and interesting because I was involved in 63, 64 in teaching children. The École Normale Supérieure, this time at Saint-Cloud, had the first program in teaching languages audiovisually and also with language labs. This was the first time. This is 1963. These are the first programs in France to begin the teaching to 5-year-old children languages. And this was begun as experiment and was intended to continue. But in fact, the truth of the matter is, for political reasons, the parents wanted their children to learn English and not German. And de Gaulle wanted to ally, you know, this is a political angle at the time in 63, 64 with Germany. And of course, de Gaulle, as you know, was anti-imperialist, anti-American. And he had never been treated well by the Americans during the war. And so, as you know, Americans had planned to occupy France as a result of the liberation. So de Gaulle actually put a stop to all these experiments in 64. But however, it is true that 63, 64 was a very interesting year. I studied at the Sorbonne, and I taught at Boulogne-Billancourt. I taught children English with all these new methods in language lab. And of course, what was devastating in November of 63 was, of course, Kennedy's assassination. And this is one of the rare moments when I was in Paris, you see, at the time, Friday evening, when on the Saturday in November 63, everybody in the street was crying. Now, this I remember. This is very impressive. I mean, knowing the so-called anti-Americanism and not to use the American language. I mean, in the French press at the time was really quite anti-American, being considered sort of imperialist. But it was very, very moving on the metro. People were crying. You know, I remember. Everybody was crying.
So then when we come to 67, 68, how did you start to experience the emergence of this crisis set of events?
Yeah. Everything was okay in 67. I mean, we're talking about the fall of 67, courses continued, we came to classes, everything was going on. What happened then in 68 were in sort of May, in May 68, what I first noticed was I had a room in an apartment in Issy-les-Moulineaux, which is a southern suburb, Metro Corentin-Salton. And what I noticed was that there were shortages in the markets, and I couldn't buy milk because they were only selling milk to mothers and not to, you know, male bachelors. And so people were, the first signs I saw were people were stocking up on food. And then, interesting enough, and this is just sort of anecdotal, but it's really interesting, the apartment I lived in was opposite the Jesuit seminary called Saint Placide in Issy-les-Moulineaux, which still exists today, which forms French priests. And what I noticed was the Jesuit priests were on revolt. They had the black flag flying. This is an anarchist flag. And I found this absolutely amazing. when I then went to École Normale Supérieure, true, there was a group of students, and this was, presumably after the takeover of Nanterre and after the takeover of the Sorbonne. And among the group of students, we were in the class, I clearly remember, with other French students, because the class with Derrida was only with American students, you see. And the class I was in studying Stendhal, and the day I remember, certainly the day, because I was to give a paper on Stendhal's use of when he could use one adjective, he always used three. And I was to give a paper on his triple use of adjectives in Gérard Genette's class. And that day, I can't remember, honestly, the day, it was in May, but obviously I can't remember the day. Before the professor came, we discussed the current situation of revolt. And then the students said, but we should take over. At that time, École Normale Supérieure was not occupied, what we call occupied. And the students said, we should occupy the École Normale Supérieure. We should. And so I said, well, here we are in class, what should we do? And then sounds very funny today, but I said, what we should do is, we should also, the form of the room was, there was one big table and there were chairs all around the table. It's just one big table. So what we should do is we should just sit on the table and we will consider this a formal occupation. We shouldn't sit on the chair, we sit on the table. So we're talking only about 12 students, you know. So we all sat on the table. Professor Genette came in, I clearly remember this. He looked at us and he said, ah, vous occupez les lieux. Ah, so you are occupying. And we all said, yes. And then he walked out. I still have an incomplete on that course, marked on my grade. And then on, we linked up. We linked up, of course, with other student movements. We can't really say this was socialist, communist, or whatever. We linked up into groups, seeing how we could develop this. And because I was from the suburbs, considered a student from the suburbs, they said, well, in my sort of action group, we should see that we should work with the trade union to make sure that the metro stations were closed down. I mean, it sounds incredible today, but, and so I said, well, my metro station is still working because that's how I get here. So in an incredible action, we were a group of students. They said, well, what we'll do is we'll make sure that the trade union has asked the stations to close down. And that's what we did. We went with the trade union to, what I should tell you is, you know, that the trade unions were more reluctant to join the movement at that time in May than the students. The students sometimes wanted to join up with the unions and the unions rejected the students. This is from memory, I'm not, referring to history books. So well, once we closed down the metro, I had no means of transport. So fortunately, I knew a young lady who lived in the Latin Quarter who was able to house me, because this leads to another interesting anecdote about May '68. Our American professors who were present, of course, told us, don't get involved, you do nothing, or you leave or you do nothing. Okay, that's clear. The young lady with whom I stayed was the daughter of the US ambassador to Norway, who was visiting Paris at the time. And that's why I was able to get mail sent through the diplomatic pouch to the UK, to my family. And I said to him, well, what are the instructions? I'm just interested in this. What does the US say? And then he gave me a fascinating instruction, which was very interesting and which shows that there are more tracts. He said, US personnel have to keep their eyes on the ground and collect all tracts, all documents. We do not demonstrate, we engage in no overt political action, either against or for the movement. What we do, our job is to collect documents and transmit them to the US. This is very interesting because it's exactly what happened after the French Revolution to the émigrés. In other words, in the Library of Congress in the US, they have the largest collection of tracts from émigrés who fled the French Revolution, plus revolutionaries who wanted to inform the US about what was happening in France. So all these tracts came to America. This is exactly the same. The tracts, there were very few tracts against, but most of the tracts were, of course, the revolutionary tracts, came to the States because after the events, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the French National Library, had a big notice, Patrimoine Français, you know, French patrimony. If you have documents pertaining to the events of May 68, because it opened up in June 68, as you know, please transmit them to the library. But in fact, to this day, as far as I know, I haven't studied the holdings, but as far as I know, the National Archives and, you know, NARA National Archives in Washington, I think, has a bigger selection of tracts than the French, probably. Now, that's just an interesting
that's very
mention, of the instruction given at the time. And there, once I was in the Latin Quarter, my recollections are of attending, of course, these meetings in the Odeon, you know, the Odeon Theatre. And I took, you know, I can't find them now. I did take photographs because the Odeon Theatre also had the red flag and the black flag. There were the two flags on the, I think there were photographs taken of that since, in the Odeon. In the Sorbonne, was regularly evacuated. It was almost impossible to, you know, to go. The Odeon Theatre was very interesting talks. I remember then, of course, there were I can't remember which date of the demonstrations, but there was a big demonstration in the Rue Gay-Lussac and the Rue de Médicis, because at the top, I still remember this vividly, at the top there's the cafe on the corner, to which I still go, called the Café Edmond Rostand. And there was just a minute, a newspaper kiosk just there. And there I distinctly remember, because I had a coffee in Edmond Rostand, and I left just at the moment when a demonstration came down at the Rue that Lussac was attacked by the CRS with tear gas. And of course I was tear gassed at the time, not because I was there, you see. And yeah, it's a horrible feeling, you know, to be tear gassed. And the whole kiosk sort of just exploded. I don't know what they'd fired at the kiosk, but I remember the whole kiosk exploding. I was not at any time arrested or, you know, but that demonstration, I recall, of course, all the posters, you know, going up. The Odeon Theatre, and discussions with students about, and what was an interesting discussion, because it happened later on at Cornell in '69, basically because of the black students. But one of the Cornell arguments, even before, I remember in '65, was that the non-access of women to the men's dormitories at Cornell in Cascadilla Hall. I remember this in '65, '66. Graduate students were expelled in '65, '66 because they received visits from their girlfriends in dormitories at Cornell. By the way, this was the same argument used by Cohn-Bendit at Nanterre, that the opposite, that male students could not visit girls in dormitories at Nanterre. This was one, I'm not saying the only reason, but it's just interesting to think about this, that one of the reasons given, you know, in '68 was actually there was no revolt at Cornell in '65, '66. It didn't happen until '69, in fact, and this was the black student revolt in '69 that I was even directly involved in there. But one of the reasons given was that there was also, I didn't feel this so much because I knew France, but apparently there was, you know, there was a heaviness of society. I mean, de Gaulle had been in power, you know, sort of 10 years. So there was this feeling, since I'd been sort of in and out, clearly I wasn't living in France at the time. So
in terms of the debates and the discussions that you obviously took part in, I mean, what was your feeling about the tone of those debates and discussions? Was it more on va refaire le monde, or was it more let's look for a way to reform this university system?
Yeah. It was similar to what later on was happening at Cornell. It was the participation. In other words, there was no taking into account of any feelings of students, any representation. You know, it was sort of a call. It was not really. I didn't feel that it was all sort of that was later on, you know, Maoist or neo-communist or whatever. No, the feeling was, let's not forget that the majority of students in those days, I mean, we're talking the 60s, were really bourgeois. I mean, you know, it was really it's a limited class already. I mean, they are a class of what we would call, they're not the working class. I mean, you know, it's not sort of as the class system in Britain, but it was really bourgeois, even though technically there was no entrance, no selection in French universities. Still, there were fewer people who got the baccalaureate in even the late 60s, obviously, than today. So it was really about restrictions on just freedom, general freedom, participation, you know, just feeling of free speech. I mean, there was only one TV channel, you know, there was the Figaro and Le Monde, but there was not really, there were satiric. I mean, this was really the breakthrough, well, we know, of Women's Lib, of like Charlie Hebdo, of harakiri, of satiric newspapers. It was a big opening up in other what we would call non-student domains. It was really the pill. The pill came to France in '67. I'm trying to think when it came to Cornell in 67. And it was 67. Just before what was the big event? You know,
you mentioned earlier the context you had with some of the trade unions in terms of trying to close.
Yeah.
How common was that attempt to link the student?
It didn't work out really. No, I mean, with the group I was in, the main question from the metro personnel to us were, well, your students, you're not members of, you're not union, why should we listen to you? Because you're not really with us. And for the unions, students were not workers. Yeah. Basically, you know, and the students were really sort of spoiled brats, paid to do nothing, and you know, studying useless, you know. No, there was really a divide. And I mean, let's be honest, in those days, you know, the Communist Party was very conservative and very, very traditional. And I'm not saying it, I mean, it did have a big hold. I mean, since 47, it was going down, but from 46 on, it's had a big hold on a lot of social activities. It was like another sort of world, and the student world. So that there was, I mean, I was not a part of the groups of students who actually went to visit factories to debate. There were students who did that and who did not succeed too well. But we have to admit that jumping on the train, we'll say, the unions then did call for all-out strikes. And that, yeah, and then and they pushed forward their demands, which actually, with the final agreement, was more socioeconomic than anything else. And the Grenelle agreements, finally, that established a lot of what we call délégués personnel, trade union so they did get representation. I mean, you know, so there was more representation. I mean, the irony, I think, is that finally, the trade unions did manage to succeed in getting more integrated into the economic sector through representation and minimum wage trade agreements than the students on their participation. And what this then freed, as I say, with Delors on 70-71, was with the adult education, but it was really to train. I mean, the managers were more successful in being trained than workers. Nevertheless, it still did not fully integrate students into the deliberating process. Whereas, I remember in the Cornell Revolt of '69, which originally, of course, was to create Black studies, one of the results, this is also interesting, of course, it did create, there were not all that many Black students at Cornell in '69, and the takeover with guns, I mean, they didn't fire any weapons, they did have some guns, but there was no firing. But actually, one of the results, I remember, because I was a member of all this, was to create a constituent assembly at Cornell in '69-70 with student representatives who could speak about subject matters, faculty matters. So this had, whereas, as far as I know, of course I left, the creation of any student senate or student constituent assembly did not exist in France, even after May '68.
I mean, the other thing that you briefly mentioned there was your encounter with the police. How did you perceive the use of violence, the role of the police, the sense of tension that existed?
Yeah, it could have been dealt with. It was really quite, I wouldn't say traumatic, it was quite dramatic. I mean, I've attended other demonstrations and seen, and it was quite, it's true that everybody says, well, the police acted admirably, there were no deaths. It's true, as far as I know, there were no, maybe one or two, but it was the sudden attack. I mean, from what we can see is the students were marching with flags and quite peacefully, and then all of a sudden, the CRS sort of charge. So to me, this was quite dramatic. Plus, it's indiscriminate tear gassing or with batons beating people who they did not previously identify as, let's say, as they would hopefully today, as sort of violent demonstrators. It was just anybody, including passers-by, kids. So that, I think, it was I think the word we would use today would be disproportionate. But I mean, the word I think would be disproportionate. Although they were saying that this was not. So this was a very, I would say, I would say it's disproportionate. We forget as well, perhaps today, that a lot of these marches or demonstrations were actually forbidden. You see, so the Sorbonne was closed, then it was reopened, then it was closed again, and I think, of course, I didn't have a car, but actually, what worried people most was, as I noticed, supplies in shops, and of course, people didn't have, for their famous weekend going out of Paris, they didn't have gas for their cars, so that there was a sort of a counter sort of revolution in May. Well, an interesting anecdote was, since I was able to get back to Issy-les-Moulineaux, and there's a helicopter port to Issy-les-Moulineaux, I was able to see, this is the famous de Gaulle's helicopter, I was able to see, once again, the movement of helicopters. Yeah, I forgot to mention the business of the militarization that didn't come into Paris itself. Since I moved, and I was able to move from time to time between Paris and Issy-les-Moulineaux, it is true that there were tanks stationed outside Paris that never moved into Paris, but there were tanks stationed outside, number one. And number two, there was a helicopter movement going on, and we know that de Gaulle did go to Baden-Baden, you know, because when he was feeling down, and then he came back again. It is true, I didn't have radio or television, so I didn't, you know, if I wanted to participate, I was there physically. I was not watching anything on TV or listening to anything on the radio.
Just to tie up that question on violence and the role of the police, how important do you think the role of the police was in perhaps encouraging other sectors of society to take part?
Say that again?
How important do you think the use of violence or the disproportionate reaction of the police, how important was that in encouraging other parts of society to get involved?
Yeah, well, it would have a double effect, you know. I mean, there were people who would think, well, you know, good, you know, these good-for-nothing students sort of thing, you know, it's time, sort of Paris got back to work. There would be people like that. And other, you know, and other groups who would say this is let the students have their say, sort of thing. Let them say what they want to say. From what I recall, which is very different from today's demonstrations that we're aware of, there were, you know, today's demonstrations also, there are casseurs, you know, there are groups who deliberately join the demonstrations just to vandalize, you know, vandals. I'm not talking, you know. At that time, and we're talking as far as I recall, I mean, obviously I wasn't present for all the demonstrations, but the demonstrations I was present at, more as a bystander, let's say, than as a, you know, an active participant. There was no vandalism. I mean, deliberate vandalism. It is true, however, that there was in those days, the streets, you know, the cobblestones taking up and making barriers in the memory of like the 1870 commune, you know, the barricades. Okay, yeah. And it's true that it's, I suppose, what later on might be considered vandalism. There was no deliberate, what shall we say, stoning of stores. The trees, let's say, chopped down, or the cobblestones lifted up, or the cars turned on the side, was to form, I'm not defending, I'm just stating, you know, what I noticed was to form barricades in memory, presumably, of the 1870 commune.
Another interesting aspect is, I mean, we talked a lot about Paris. How aware were you of what was happening beyond Paris in other regions?
I only heard about that afterwards, since apparently radio and TV were, I mean, my wife was a student in Strasbourg, you know, in those days, and I didn't know her at the time. You know, it's true, events were happening elsewhere, but, you know, at the time, no, I was not aware. But it's true, afterwards, we became aware of that. And of course, once June came around with the sort of the counter revolt, as I say, I mean, it's heavily criticized today. I don't think that any what shall we say, Fruits of '68 came into being, but it came into being maybe socio-politically in the early '70s, and in Roca's autogestion really didn't come into being until the false attempt at sort of company self-management until the 1980s, which didn't work well. And remember that Jacques Delors himself refused to become president. You know, he refused to continue on the presidential line, and Roca, as you know, was kicked out by Mitterrand, although many of Roca's ideas were on from the socio-economic point of view with that. And of course, let's be clear, today's so-called decentralization of universities is decided still from the top, and is not this so-called autonomy of universities, okay, is decided. The top has to agree. When the top agrees, that's okay. I mean, you know, but when, for instance, if there's a master's program, I mean, it has to go through. It's not. I mean, according to me, I'm following this. It's not similar to British regional authorities. I mean, Newcastle University of Durham was, the regional authorities dealt with that. Or I'm not even talking about the states. No, in France, I'm not saying it's still Napoleonic where, every page is followed, but there is still a national program, okay, for the baccalaureate. It's decided by the Education Ministry, and it's top down, yeah, even to this day. Well, although, they say, well, be interdisciplinary, but the decision to be interdisciplinary is taken top down. The decision not to move with Greek and Latin is still top down. The decision to do away with bilingual education, meaning French and German. I mean, bilingual in the USA means French. It means English, Spanish. Okay. Bilingual in UK means any two languages. Bilingual, it's interesting just, socioculturally to think about this. Bilingually in France usually means French-German.
As an international student in France in '68, how were you, or how important did you feel the sort of international?
No, you still had to have a visa. I mean, okay, let's be clear. Both for American students and British students in '67 coming in, Britain was not part of the European Union in '67, and of course not America. We still had to get student visas. We still had to go through the student registration process, which obviously today it's all internet, it's all computerized, but in those days you actually had to go, and it was a lot of bureaucracy. What can I say? There was a lot of red tape. No, we all managed to. And what happened was the people who'd been through it previously helped, obviously, the newcomers. So it was also by word of mouth, this office you go to first, and then this, and then all I can say is it was a lot of red tape going through all this. Not only for the British students, I mean, there were other non-French students and American students. There was it was a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucratic red tape. I still think it's probably made, the bureaucratic red tape exists, it's probably made easier now by, when my son registered for university, it was made, it was still red tape, but it was made easier.
Was your experience of the events difficult as an international student?
No. Except that when we discussed together, because of the interest, I'm not so sure that we actively participated in demonstration, much more as bystanders, because the main, I forgot to tell you this, the main interest, and we're talking about US students in France at the time, the main interest was Vietnam. The discussions that people had who were American students with me was about McGovern, about Hubert Humphrey, about I was not an American, but I knew about, because I'd spent from, after all, 65 to 67 in the States. So the main interest of these American students, although they were in Paris, was still thinking about Vietnam, thinking about McGovern, thinking about Humphrey, thinking about US politics. And it was sort of a far cry from the student demonstrations. It's true, our American professors did not get involved, but from what I've read since, many French professors did. From what I know, and from what I've read, Jacques Derrida himself was never involved in any of the May '68. Okay, a year later. But from what I know, I haven't read to the contrary, and as far as I know, I haven't come across any, there's no book called École normale supérieure pendant les événements de mai 68. From what I know, Jeanette was not involved in this. I've tried to find, there were not, and some leading, René Raymond, who is a leading historian, because he's written a lot on Vichy, he was the head at the Sorbonne at the time, and his own office, unfortunately, was occupied, ransacked, etc. And so this was sort of negative, I think that there were many professors who did not involve themselves. I'm not saying they were against it or for it, they were just distancing themselves from it.
And you mentioned there how important the Vietnam issue was for American students.
Yeah.
How important were international issues such as Vietnam for French students?
Yeah, well, it's interesting this. One of the origins of May 68 was the arrests of French students who were involved in an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. And so there was a clear interest in demonstrating against the Vietnam War. This was linked, as I mentioned, to the basic, what shall we say, of the left in France, of the anti-American imperialist movement and the pro-Che Guevara. You know, I mean, we're forgetting all this at the time. It really sounds past history, but I mean, in the highest reaches, I mean, the movement again, you know, was thought of that, you know, de Gaulle has the middle way, not communism and not American imperialistic capitalism. So we're on the middle way. But so at the same time, no, the students were against, certainly, and there were demonstrations. One of the reasons the students arrested. No, my concern was later on, the activities I engaged in relation to the Vietnam War in Cornell, especially in Middlebury, because it was still going on from 70 to 72. And just one item of maybe of interest is that in university campuses at the time, ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, had a stand at the beginning of every university year, you know, to enlist incoming freshers, new students to the ROTC program, okay? Reserve Officer Training Corps. So this is a military, this is an army, and they had a table, okay? In Middlebury, I was a member of faculty in 1970. So this is an incredible story. I proposed that since the army had a table, why didn't the Internal Revenue Service have a table? Since the Internal Revenue Service is an agency of the US government and is a non-military agency, and it's a civil agency. Most people don't like the Internal Revenue, so that's okay. So I wasn't saying I like them or I don't like them, but so I proposed a motion to the faculty saying that at every beginning of the year, not only, I wasn't going to abolish ROTC, you know, I'm not in favor of censorship, let the ROTC have a table. But why shouldn't the Internal Revenue Service not have a table to try to attract students to become members of the tax community of tax inspectorate? And there was, oh no, that was horrendous. I mean, I mean, you know, that was an awful debate, and I was obviously hounded, you know, that never got past. That was the even worse debate, I think, than trying to propose that we teach French cinema. So that never got off. But I was saying to myself, I'm not an American, so I have no voice in this, and I'm not an American citizen. On the other hand, I am a world citizen. I consider myself, you know, a citizen of the world, and I don't appreciate, you know, only the military, only what the military is doing at that time. On the other hand, I'm not again, you know, if there's a positive issue, so why don't we see a civil issue to this? And since the tax money is going there, so that way, and so I mean, that was just a point. Obviously, later on there was Kent State, if you remember, there was the shooting at Kent State. There were demonstrations against that, and also at that time, people forget this today, to avoid students going to, you know, when a student got a C grade, they were then had to drop out and they risked being enlisted. Remember, Vermont is very near Canada. So students usually had two options. One, they had to get good grades. The second, if they thought that's right, or if they were really bad, they go to Canada. Now, as faculty, obviously, we didn't suggest they go to. We obviously suggest they get good grades. But what we then had to do, and maybe people have never said this before, is we had to change, let's say, the grading system, where a B did not mean D. It meant, you know, if you got a B, you were really bad, which meant that you really had, if you were good, it wasn't A, it was like A++. This was actually, people forget this today. Today it's banal in the American universities to say A++, A plus, A minus, A minus minus, B++. Nobody remembers the origin of this. The origin was, before Vietnam, it was A, B, C, D. Because of Vietnam, they had to change this to A++, A plus, and A. Isn't that interesting? And education, because everybody obviously knew, well, they knew or they didn't know, but it was to avoid these poor kids. Now, there were cases, and I have to admit this, I did have students who plagiarized, even in my famous cinema course. And they did risk expulsion. And I had to, I mean, they did. And I'm very strict on play. I don't want plagiarism. I had to call the students in. The student came with the parents. Everybody was crying. The parents were crying. The student was crying. And how did I, this is before internet. Today there's plagiarism by internet. This was before. You had to write an essay on the films of Alain Resnais, you know, the French, right. In those days, we're talking 1972. In those days, there were only 2 books in French on Alain Resnais, okay? Everything is done in French, as you know, in Middlebury. I looked at his essay, and I seemed to recognize things. What he did was, he had mixed chapters from the 2 books, and he just sort of made a mixed, he made a sort of a mishmash of the 2. It was just total plagiarism, but sort of combined the 2 books, which I could easily prove since there were only 2 books. So I made a deal with him and the parents. I said, okay, no paper. We're going to have an oral exam, you know, an oral exam for 3 hours, face-to-face, 3-hour oral exam, face-to-face, where we're going to discuss French cinema. You've seen all the films. I mean, all the films on the course. Presumably you've read most of the books. You've read these 2 French books, and you know you're fluent in French, so you can read all the French books. They're not, in those days, there were not. You know, we like to think, you know, there are hundreds and hundreds of books on French cinema, maybe today, but I think each French director, and even in '72, there were only 1 or 2 books, you know, in French on them. There was a Cahiers du Cinéma, but so we had the 3-hour exam, and you know, he more or less managed to pull it through to avoid expulsion, because otherwise that would have meant probably getting to Vietnam. It's true, there were students who voluntarily, I didn't know any of them, but they voluntarily went to Canada. Of course, one of the other good excuses to Canada for poor students is there were sports scholarships. And I remember I had members of the Olympic hockey team, and they were very proud, and they told me, but I said, why don't you come to my class? And they say, well, we have to practice hockey. We're members of the Olympic hockey team. So I said, I'm sorry, that's no excuse, you know. And they said, but we're on a hockey scholarship. So I said, yeah, but why are you registered for my French class? So, you know, because that's the big thing. That doesn't exist, obviously, in France or in the UK, coming to a university because, okay, you're a hockey champion, but why, you know, fake this whole system and take courses that you don't take? So I was very strict as well. This, by the way, shocked other American professors who said, but, you know, they're present, you know, they're at the university. I said, no, for me, no. They have to be in my course, in my French course. And just because they're in the Olympic hockey team, this comes from, I wouldn't say my dislike for sports, but, you know, in England, I had enough of that. And I said, from the age of 5, if ever, you know, I don't have to involve myself in sports, I'll do that. So there we are.
Getting back to 68, I mean, what can you remember? Can you recall your assessment of the politicians at the time?
Politicians?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't seem to grasp what was happening. Huh? And I remember afterwards which was, they tried to recuperate the power. I mean, I always respected Mendes France, but then he allowed himself to be, I wouldn't say kidnapped, but he allowed himself to be taken on board. So no, and I thought even de Gaulle, I mean, Pompidou pushed himself forward. That was a very interesting action. Of course, as you know, de Gaulle called it chien lit. I mean, for de Gaulle, everything was order, and of course, since then, it's true that since I've worked a lot, obviously, on Vichy, I've come actually to respect de Gaulle's actions, obviously, from 40 to 44 to a great deal, to such an extent that a book I recently published on the French resistance that I presented at New York University in Paris, the president of the de Gaulle Association in Paris attended, and we had a discussion. But at the time, I don't think, we're talking about 68, I really don't think, de Gaulle seized this, but not on the right. But I really don't think that the people on the left seized it. And what happened is he didn't come forth at the time, but people like Delors and Rocard did seize it, didn't come forward at the time, but later on did move in that direction.
What was your feeling when the events were brought to a close in June 68? Was it a sense of disappointment or relief?
No, well, I thought, in June of 68, what affected me more, I think, was Robert Kennedy's assassination. I was in Paris. And June, it was more or less relief that, we could go back. It was yes and no, because from what I recall, classes then began again, but on a very low, very sporadic, very low level, not very dynamic. And what affected me most, well, there were two incidents. One, my grandmother died in June, who came from Kishinev, emigrated in 1905 to come to England. And so my grandmother died in June, and that was sad. And then really I was affected by, I even went to the US Embassy in June to sign the register after Robert Kennedy's assassination, saying the future has been assassinated. That, because I'd been living, probably in America, and got attuned so much with America, and that mattered to me. And then, now this might seem very strange, at the time, because of my Romanian studies, I was involved actually in doing research, believe it or not, in Romania in the summer of 68. And here we come to another big crisis I found myself in. This is an incredible situation where, thanks to a Cornell University grant, they were very open and very. They supported me in my attempt to do research in Romania itself in July, August of 68. When I informed the British consular officials in Paris at the time, because of course I was a British citizen, all they said to me was, "We will not recognize you if anything happens to you in Romania. It's a communist country, and you're going at your own risk." I said, "Thank you very much." And I got my visa. It was under the Iron Curtain, and as you know, in Romania, I went to Bucharest, and and I met a lot of people. What we forget today is that in those days, Ceausescu was in good cahoots with Britain and France. In other words, he visited the Queen and Pompidou, and the West supported Ceausescu in his anti-Soviet stance. Although At that time, when I was in, by the way, the author has written a book, an American author, I can't remember the name, unknown to me, he was in Bucharest at the time. Beck, a book, Updike, that's right. John Updike, at the same time, unknown to me, wrote about this in a book called Beck, a book. Apparently he was in Bucharest. But Romania was doing a Mao, everybody had a little Mao collars. There were a Maoist and people walked backwards from, because I was invited to the Romanian Academy. See, I had, from the Romanian embassy in Paris, they gave me permission to go. Although it is true, I underwent all the Securitat interviews, interrogations, no torture interrogations. However, what happened was, I think you remember, I think it was the 21st of August, Czechoslovakia was invaded by all the forces of the Soviet Union, but not Romania. Ceausescu refused. However, I was not Romanian and I was not Czech, so everybody else was considered a spy. So on August 21st, I decided to leave Bucharest. Well, what happened in Bucharest was the army and the police had, and this was, you know, when you walked on the street, they held their rifles towards the people to avoid any demonstration. So the police were out with rifles pointing to everybody. I decided to leave, but unfortunately, I couldn't get out of the country. So the Romanian authorities decided to send me to Bulgaria, to Sofia, and to be kept in Bulgaria for the duration of the time. So I ended up in, I was very young at the time, I ended up in a sort of a no transit zone in a Bulgarian airport at the end of August '68, until the Czech crisis had calmed down, and I was allowed to take the first flight from Bulgaria on a Romanian airline to Paris, where I was met in Paris in a car by Romanian authorities. I refused to go into the car. They wanted to so-called debrief me in the Romanian embassy. We're in 1968, we're in probably the end of August '68 in Paris. And I refused. Fortunately, I was on French territory, you see, so I said, no, I'm a British citizen on French territory. I refuse to go. And of course, since then, everything's cleared up, and I've been back to Romania several times, and I have very excellent contacts to this day with everybody in the Romanian, you know, Cultural Institute and everything, and have published in Romania, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But it's true. What was interesting was when I went back to Romania after the fall, you know, after '89, like in the '90s, and I went back, I could recognize people from sort of both sides, if you see what I mean, because there had been people who'd been, you know, imprisoned or excluded by Ceausescu and other people. But that year, '67, '68 was really, you know, since I got back to Cornell, and then of course Cornell in '68, '69 then began the revolt at Cornell. I mean, in another sense.
What did your parents and your friends think of what was happening with you in France?
As long as I was well and in health, I sent letters regularly, keeping them, you know, informed. There was my mother died in '62, so there was only my late father and my late brother. No, when I got letters, it was basically really about being safe and in good health, you know, wherever I was. And I can't. Let's be serious. I can't really think that I discussed political or events with my father and brother. I mean, I have kept all the letters. I mean, they're in my archives, and I don't have them here. I'll have to look at them again. I don't think I discussed political events. With my friends I did, but not then. And then obviously at Cornell, what I found sad, by the way, if I can just make a comment, at Cornell, when at Cornell in Romance Studies, the students, I wouldn't say took over, but wanted representation with the faculty about students. A great professor of French and German literature, Herbert Diekmann, who had known Nazi Germany, you see, who had known that period, compared, I remember this, compared the student activism at Cornell in 1969 to 70 to the Hitler Youth students that he had known in German universities in the 1930s, which I thought personally regrettable. But he said, well, you're acting in the same way as these students did in German universities. And I said, and I tried to say to him, no, we're not trying to force, the German students tried to force their political views and their political angle on universities by exclusion, by excluding, you know, communists, Jews, etc. I said that we are asking for inclusion. We are asking for representation and inclusion as part of the university world, you know, faculty, administrators, students, and not that.
And that demand for inclusion and participation, how much do you think your experience in France?
That might have helped. Yeah, that probably, with other students, I remember with other students, we had discussions at that time. They were not violent. I remember there was another fellow student. She since became a full professor at Middlebury and has since retired now, I think, living in Florida. We discussed with SDS. At that time, that was the creation, you remember, Students for a Democratic Society. This movement, SDS, that we were at the origin, I mean, we didn't create it, but we knew people who were at the origin. Originally, the reason for the SDS was this integration. Unfortunately, as we know, the SDS went off to a violent, confrontational situation, as we know. But in the beginning, I remember this other fellow student said, well, what we should do is join the SDS. And I remember I said, no, we shouldn't do that, because that will be a party affiliation there. I think they want to become a political party. I said, we don't want to be a political party. We're speaking for all students. We're not, you know, we want inclusion and a representation of all, just the same as today. One battle I have never ever won, even today, is, even in France, no taxation without representation, which is still an 18th century issue. As you know, non-French citizens living in France still pay taxes, and they're not represented unless they're EU members. Now with Brexit, this will affect me, of course, so this is another problem. But non-French citizens, who, whether they're European or non-European, who are legally in France, who pay taxes, are not represented, even to this day. And of course, it's the same in the US. Recent US immigrants who become US nationals, who pay US taxes, are still not represented for a number of years. So I always say to people that we're still in the 18th century. I mean, we're still, there should certainly, this is revolutions, according to me, my humble opinion, are always fiscal. They're always, the French Revolution was really a tax revolution. And it's a fiscal revolution for the people who have money. The regrettable situation is that the immigrant situation of the people who do not have. I mean, you know, and so for the people who have, you know, the 1%, and the 90%, but I mean, there are very serious problems here. But to think that for the people who have, they still have not solved a problem of the 18th century, and we're in the 21st century. is still incredible. So Europe, Brussels has still not solved that problem. There should be no taxation without representation, which was, as you know, the British move. And that is a battle. There are two battles I have not won. One, I've never won that. The second one is, of course, now Britain has left the EU. But at the time, for example, when Britain joined the EU, I wanted British citizens to be able to vote. This was before British citizens could vote. Okay. Now, British citizens can vote in municipal elections and European elections, but not in French national elections and not in British national elections. So if you're a British citizen of less than 15 years standing in France, you can vote in British elections. If you're a British citizen in France of more than 15 years standing, according to the situation until Brexit, you cannot, which means that no British citizen resident in France of more than 50 years standing can vote either in French national elections or in British national elections. So this is a deprivation of human rights, according to me. It's a battle I've lost. I mean, I'm just saying this, you know, as an internationalist, this is another battle that has still not been won. And now with Brexit, of course, we're going to an incredible situation, which is the situation I knew, by the way, in 1973, when I had to ask for a research visa to come to France in 73 from the French consul in Liverpool, I used to remember. And we're going back, presumably, they haven't had Article 50 yet, but it'll take 2 years. So I will have to, I'm still a British citizen, okay, resident in France. And resident in the US because of my other status. I will have to decide in 2 years. But I don't think Britain has realized yet how this will affect all, not only in France, there are 150,000 UK residents in France. And we'll assume, I think, from what I read, the statistics are in the 27 European countries, there are 1.5 million UK residents. That's an enormous number in the 27 other countries.
So, Brexit discussion because I will.
No, but it's another discussion. But I'm just saying that. But we're going. No. I mean, one of the reasons I think of May '68 was representative. No, I mean, with a form of recognition of. Okay, you can call it a special privileged group, but I mean it was recognition of that group in the larger system.
And so building on that and touching on some of the areas you've briefly mentioned already, how did you perceive the impact, what were the consequences of '68 for France overall?
Well, as I said, the consequences did happen in the reforms of 70-71. And it took a long time for the move to the left, as you know, 71 to 81, until, well, you know, it did take when Mitterrand became president, and it took France basically, although we like to think Britain is conservative, France finally is a very conservative society and has its revolutions, you know, through its demonstrations, and likes to think itself revolutionary, just like, it sounds horrible, but it likes to think that it believes in liberty, equality, and fraternity, whereas if, you know, there isn't all that much fraternity, there's a lot of racism and xenophobia, okay, freedom, not for everybody, equality, okay, but there's the argument between, and I've written on this, on equity and equality. You know, equity is proportionality and equality is really equal. Now, I understand that France, only recently they have another debate, should French universities be selective, because they're not selective. But the problem with the dropout rate is that, like, you know, 30% of French students drop out of year one because they are badly advised from high school. In other words, it's a question of career advice. It's not a question that French universities are bad. So they're blaming the whole, they say universities should not be selective. Now they're coming to the conclusion that will, maybe. And of course, as you know, since the end of the war, in other words, since the late 1940s, France has a double education system. They have what are called the grandes écoles, écoles normales supérieures. They have the grandes écoles, polytechnique, etc. And you have the universities. But this is unique in the world. Okay, we can say in Britain you have Oxford, Cambridge, but still, or LSE. Nevertheless, you have equal. US is another, you have state universities, you have private. But France is unique on that because with the same program, it's very, very difficult. And we know that a lot of students drop out, in the fourth form. The dropout rate is very high. And I mean, France currently has, as we know, 3 million unemployed and 3 million underemployed, which means there's 6 million. And it's very high. The working population of France is about 28 to 30 million out of a population of 66 million. So, and of the 30 million, only half earn enough to pay taxes, and they're reducing taxes on the under-earners. I still believe on the taxation system that at least they should pay €1 a month. So, so I'm just saying there is and it's true, it's the middle class that are being overtaxed. And so this is leading to a revolt on the left and on the right, since the 15 to 20 million of the 66 million who actually pay tax. And if you remember, when Hollande was elected in the beginning, he said, if you're rich, you earn €4,000 a month. That's, let's say £4,000. The average salary for the people who earn, the average is about €2,000 a month. And the minimal salary, the SMIC, the minimum is around €1,000 a month. So most people, it's true, in between, and that's, I mean, with housing rates, it's not enough. So there we are.
Okay. I'm going to try and ask you a couple of questions about the impact that you think the events of '68, your experience of those events, had on you specifically. So did your experience in 1968 have an impact on how you understood the way France works, or did it confirm it?
Yes, but sometimes, yeah. I've written a lot about negotiation. Yeah, France moves by fits and starts and jumps and strikes and these sort of mini revolutions. No, '68 was a major upheaval, we can say. That was a major upheaval. A sort of a minor upheaval was, after all, Mitterrand's victory in '81. I mean, the abolition of the death penalty. So we can say this. But it moves in fits and starts. You see, the problem is the concept of negotiation, which doesn't really exist in French culture. What I mean is, first of all, you go on strike and force and violence, and then it leads to negotiation. Usually, the way I define negotiation is, when negotiation breaks down, you should go to mediation, and then you should go to arbitration. And when negotiation, mediation, and arbitration break down, then, okay, then you can strike. But it should be in the fourth position. In France, usually, yeah, I mean, this is, and it just confirms this. I mean, yesterday I came on EasyJet from Bath from Bristol to Paris, and before I went, I learned that EasyJet pilots are suffering from stress, and they want to strike on the 21st. That's today. I haven't read what's happening, but Air France pilots as well recently striked. But what you don't read about too much of it on the news is all about strikes and demonstrations, is about the negotiation. What is the negotiation process? Why don't they tell us? They usually mention that following, it's like with the problem of the milk quotas, etc. The milk purchasers refuse to negotiate, and the milk, but why don't they, analyze what point did they refuse it? What are the options? What are the variables? I mean, I think they should start treating the French public, at least, not only with visions of demonstrations and strikes and violence. I really think they should start on all the channels. They should really start treating them really as adults and saying, here are the negotiation steps. What are the milk producers not doing? What are the variables? What are the options? I mean, if there are no variables, I mean, this is, what is this? What is Brussels doing? How, do you get my point? In other words, they should really, so I mean, those are the major upheaval. And I think it's putting a lot of things into question. It's just it's the students are saying, take us into account. The Labour leadings put their program together, which obviously was what were the Labour leaders? Remember, we're still in what's called the Trente Glorieuses. In other words, French economy in the late 60s was a little downturn, but we're still okay. We're still okay. It wasn't, the 72 was the oil crash, but we're still okay. And what the unions are saying is, we want a larger part of the pie. Well, they got it, actually, with the Grenelle negotiations. The students were not saying we want a larger part, they're saying we want to be heard. We are an integral part of society. So it's a sort of a situational situation. We are not marginal. So, no, I think, now it's true that since 68, I mean, it's true, it's come in for a lot of backlash, it's true. It's like an insult, today it's almost considered an insult, like to be a 68 heures, to be considered a 68 heures is really to be considered sort of presumably like the people of the 50s and 60s considered the generation of the 1920s and 30s, Fitzgerald, the Great Gatsby. Yeah, it's presumably, I mean, I'm just trying to think, sociologically, historically, I think that people think of the 60s generation, 68, much as probably the people of the 1950s probably thought about the flappers of the 20s and 30s and the Great Gatsby. I mean, I'm just trying to imagine this. I remember my father always used to say, and he would still say this in the 60s, that the best period was the 1920s and 30s, and so...
What do you think the impact on you personally or politically was of your experience in 68? How would you summarize the impact that experience had on you personally?
Well, no, to be aware of, even though I'm sort of 75, still to be aware of the young, to be aware of students, to be aware of, and still obviously to be aware of trade union, except the attitude has, although the Communist Party has declined, the attitude of trade unions doesn't seem to have improved all that much. But no, to be aware of student concerns still, and since I'm still involved in universities, there is a disturbing aspect, of course, of what we would call polite in the US universities in politeness and polite talk and censoring anything that could put students at risk. But of course, being a student is to be put at risk and to hear different views. That's another debate. On polite speech. No, I think it's made me aware, and it certainly had an effect. Certainly through Cornell, through the 60s, certainly in the 70s in Middlebury. And coming back, of course, I was lived in France through the reforms of the 70s, thanks to the French reforms of the 70s. As a result of the 60s, I integrated myself into the French vocational education system. So
yeah, and so on that, do you think that your experience of the events in 68 had an impact on your? Obviously, you mentioned this, how it had some sort of impact on your career trajectory, but also did it have an impact on your research, on your scholarship around France?
No, not as much. No, not as much as one might think. These topics I was interested in whether film, theatre, cinema, Romanian studies, which I was interested in from the mid-60s, have still remained of interest. Obviously, political situations change, cultural situations change, but no, my interest, I mean, I still go to the Avignon Theatre Festival, which began as a result. I still say that the main education acts, and this is for Britain and for France, are the 1948 education acts. I mean, if France was just to, I mean, they keep saying, you know, if you read the program, they keep saying, you know, why don't we apply this, you know, the Programme de la Résistance. In fact, it's true that if France was to apply even an education program dealing with juvenile delinquents, prisoners of 1948, even one of the reasons, by the way, of the US federal court cases against French banks was that France did not fully apply the restitution laws of 1948. I mean, it sounds incredible. So today, you know, but as I even said to the people in the French government, had you applied all these 48 laws, you would not have had all these. Had you not opened it up to non-French citizens, I mean, of the 300,000 deportees, Jewish deportees from France, I mean, 76,000, 50% were not French. Of the 300,000 Jews living in France, 50%, 150,000 were not French. And how can you exclude them in 1948 from any indemnification, you see? So, and education acts were not all. This is the problem in France, by the way. They pass laws just as the work law passed, but you have to have in French law what are called décrets d'application. These are decrees that apply the law. So a law in France, you can have hundreds and hundreds of laws, but as long as you don't have the decrees that apply the law, then the law is moot. I'm just saying so there are still laws in France that have not been applied because the decree has not been published. It sounds incredible.
Oh, that is incredible. France is incredible. You kind of mentioned this in that idea of the way 68 are perceived in France, but I just wanted to ask you a question about the collective memory of 68 in France. So as someone who participated in the events, I'm sure you kept a keen interest in how the story of 1968 has been told across the last 40, almost 50 years now. And I just wondered if you had an opinion on the extent to which the dominant narrative actually tells the whole story.
Yeah, I'm not sure it has held up really. It's sort of moving really into the past. It's not considered probably to have been. I mean, okay, maybe historians could have said it be an upheaval, but in discussions even today, it's true. It's not considered a major event.
Do you think it's considered in positive terms or in negative terms?
No, I think today, no, it's considered probably neither positive nor negative, but depending on the, it's interesting, for example, that on the French left, they never want to bring that up, you know, in 68. And of course, the French right will only bring it up to castigate. So that's an interesting point, you see. So and of course, today's students, they have new battles every year. I mean, because there's a new education secretary or minister every year, and so there's a new education reform every year, which leads to new strikes, to new, you know. I mean, I'm talking about France. I'm not talking on the 28th. I mean, there's no coordination. I mean, what incredible in Europe. I mean, here we have a so-called European University in Venice, but there's zero coordination on, let's say Britain is still part of Europe. Well, let's say it's not. The 27 European countries on it. There was the big success of the project of to send students, you know, to all European countries. That's a success, you know, that program. But otherwise, if we're talking about education policy, not to have a uniform education, but just to have overall discussions, No, so no, I don't think 68 forms a part of that from the education point of view. And from the trade union point of view, knowing that even today in France, only 17% of employees are members of a trade union. Okay, that's very low. And okay, that makes 600,000 basically. So it's the current status of trade union membership out of a working population of from 28 to 30 million is 600,000 members. I'm just to give you global figures on this.
I'm going to ask you one more thing before we finish, I've asked everyone, and will ask everyone to do this. If you had 30 seconds to sum up your experience in 1968, how would you do it?
An educational revolution that did not fully succeed.
Okay, thank you very much.